In this video, we're going to look at integration tests. Hi, my name's Mark Bradley and welcome to Testing All the Things, a screencast in which we use live coding to demonstrate different types of testing tools and techniques. In this video, we're going to continue with the REST service we created in the previous video. We are going to add functionality that allows us to start talking to the database. Let's look at the code. Since the previous episode, I have added a few changes to the project. The first thing I've done is updated the dependencies. I'm now also bringing in Doctrine and the PHP dependency injection package. I've also updated the composer setup. So if we look at the Docker Compose, I have added a Postgres database to my Docker Compose file. So we've got a database to store our books in. I've also updated the make file. The make file now waits for the DB to be up before continuing, and then it creates the schema set up in Doctrine. The one last thing I have done is created a book class that stores information about a book and configured that to work with Doctrine. Now that I've shown you the setup changes I've made before we started the video, let's get on with our first test. We're going to start by adding an end-to-end test. I've already created a books test class, and I've set up so that we have an instance of a Doctrine entity manager in this class. And there is a placeholder test ready for us to start filling in. During this video, we're going to make a very simple get book by its ISBN endpoint on our API. Let's make our first end-to-end test of this new API. Test get book by ISBN. So there we have it. We have our endpoint ready. And now if we quickly go and grab our guzzle setup from the previous test, we can put this into here. So shouldn't expect an exception this time, so everything should be fine. We want to get a resource which is a book, and we want to get it by its ISBN. So the ISBN for our book will be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. That's our API call set up. But obviously if we call that, there's nothing yet in our database. So we need to go back to the start of our test and set up our test ready to run. So we can create a new book, equals new book. It takes the ISBN, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Start this straight on the new lines, make it neater and readable. There we go. And the title, testing all the things. Author is Bradley. Go. And number of pages is, well, let's go for 564. There we go. So now we have a book. We need to push that into our database. So this entity manager, and we want to persist the book, and want to also flush to ensure it's been written. There we go. So now we've got our setup, our arrangement of our test is to put a book into our database. Then our acting is to make an API call to the endpoint we expect, book slash and its ISBN. And now we can make our assertions. So our client will return a response. So we can make our assertions on that. This assert equals. So let's check first that we get a 200 status code. So 200 response get status code. So that was reasonably straightforward. The next thing we want to do is we want to check that the body of our response contains the items of the book, the details of the book in the format that we expect. So we'll create some expected JSON. That's an array. And speed things up, we will steal it from here. Okay. So ISBN. Let's do ISBN and title and author and number of pages. There we go. That's our expected JSON. Now we can get our actual JSON from the response. So actual JSON equals JSON decode the response, get content, get body, get content. There we go. And we want that into an array, so we pass true. And now we can make our assertion. So like this. Assert equals expected JSON equals the actual JSON. So we now have our test fully set up. We are sticking something into the database, trying to access that resource and checking that we get the appropriate responses back. So let's go and run our test. Make test. Now, along with make test, because if this fails during any of those steps of the make, it won't bring down the Docker containers. I'm just going to add an or Docker compose down. There we go. So that our Docker containers get cleaned up after every test run. So let's run that. So everything's come down and our test has failed. So let's go and look at that. So we got an exception. Because it threw an exception, we got an exception thrown, 404 not found. So we know that we're not hitting a root at this point. And let's just look a bit higher as well. So you can see the schema being set up here and the waiting for the database to come up happening before the test was run. So let's start trying to solve the problem in front of us. So we're getting a 404, so we need a root set up. So let's do that. If we open our app, okay. So currently we don't have a root set up. So let's try and fix that. Let's close that. There we go. And we'll add our new root. So app, and it's going to be a get again. And the pattern we want is /book. slash, and then we need to say we want the ISBN to be the second value there. Okay. And now we take the same function. And if we return a response, that should solve our 404 problem. So we'll just double check that before we move on. So our exception has gone away, and we're getting a 200 now because we're getting to line 61. So if we get to 61 on our test, that's the body check. So we're getting past the 200. That's coming back fine, but we seem to be getting a null or an empty string coming back. So the JSON decode's not quite working. So now we need to start solving how we obtain a book from the database. So we can do some rough sketching out at this point of what we want this to look like. So we want something, we'll just do a comment, so something like book equals, and then we need some kind of a book repository, so we'll call book repo. Now, would you want to call it find or get, or we want to do get, because this is, we're kind of pretty certain, we should be certain that the ISBN exists, so we want to use a get rather than a find, not doing a search. So get by ISBN. Now we need to be able to pass an ISBN in at this point, and there is a third argument to this function can have, and that is $args. And if we use $args, what we can do then, we can do $args, and then it's a array, so we just do, and we take the same name that's in here. So this is giving us a little idea of how we want our book repository, what allows us to obtain books from the database, or where if we choose to keep them. We've kind of designed out the interface, and at this point we could create an interface, but we're not going to go straight into the implementation and testing of the book repository. So let's make a start on that. This is where it becomes interesting. So we're about to create something that is going to interact with our database, and it's going to interact with our database through Doctrine. Now at this point we could bring something like Mockery or some other test double framework into our code base and start mocking the calls that we make to Doctrine, and but doing this requires us to make assumptions about how Doctrine works, and we are starting to do something, and it would also be something that's not considered very good. Mocking something that you don't own is not considered safe in testing, because A, you don't understand all the intricacies of the thing you're mocking, and B, you don't own it, so that interface can change and the way it works might adapt between versions. But your tests still pass, and then you have fragile tests because your tests have made assumptions on how some code you don't own works, rather than using something like an integration test, which we're about to do instead, which tests your code's interaction not only with that final database and storage solution, but also with the code that you don't own that you're going to use to interact with that database. So let's start on that test now. So I've already got a placeholder test, and now we know that we want to make a book repository. Let's just do a quick refactor. So it's a book repository. Can't spell this evening. Book repository test. There we go. Okay, thank you. So that refactor's done, and now we need to give a, so let's call it get by ISBN. So there we go. So we have our test set up. And again, our book repository wants to talk directly to the database and make use of Doctrine. So we need to set up Doctrine. So we'll take some code from our end-to-end test. Okay, so we'll bring in the connection code into our test. In fact, let's do it nicely. Let's actually bring the whole setup. It's a bit tidier. Okay, there we have it. So we now have the ability in this new integration test to connect to the database, and we could store a new book. So let's do that. So we'll do book equals new book. And make the ISBN go backwards this time, 9 down to 1. Title, even more testing. Me, and how many pages can I bang on about testing this time? Well, let's go 2,900 pages of testing. There we go. Riveting read. Okay, so this entity manager, and we want to persist. Persist the book. And again, we want to flush and make sure it's in the database. So for this, manager flush. And away we go. Excellent. So now we've set up our test again. We've got a book sitting in our database at this point. So we want to create our book repository. So book repo equals new book repository. And we know already it needs to take an instance of Doctrine Entity Manager, so we'll pass that straight in. This Entity Manager, that's done. And now we need to get our book. Our book equals the book repo. And we decided to call the function get by ISBN, get by ISBN. And the ISBN is here. Okay. And made a bit of mistake here because we've got book and book. So this is, let's call this actual book. And let's call this one expected book. Okay. So refactor there. There we go. And the final thing we need to do is we need to check that the expected book matches the actual book. Okay, so there is our test all set up. Now what we need to do is create our book repository. So before we run the test and see it fail, let's create that class, book repository, and it needs to go into the source directory. There we have it. Book repository sits in the source. If we now move this over to the right, so you can see both together. We'll do a bit of tidy up, don't get that comment. Okay, and we need our function add method. So it's public method takes the string ISBN. You know, it returns a book. And for it to work anyway, now we've said it returns a book, we need to return a book. So we'll just create a new book so we can at least run our test. So let's start running that test. We will still obviously see one failure for our end-to-end test, but we're looking for the failure to fix the failure of our book repository test failure just now. There we go. What we got? So silly me, I forgot to add the values, so we'll just quickly speed through that, create some empty values, and run that test again. Here we go. So we now, the tests are finished, we have a look at this, we can see that we're getting the empty book back where it was expecting the book with the details back. And we obviously could just quickly hard code these, but let's skip that step and actually implement the functionality. Tidy up this import and create the field. Get rid of that. There we go. Okay. So we have reasonably sensible class now. Let's remove this line because we don't want that. So now we can make use of our entity manager to obtain a book by its ISBN. So we can make a start on that. So this entity manager, we want to get a repository for book class. Again. So we've got the repository now for a book. So we can do, well, just simplify this and do return $this. Oh no, sorry. We need to repo equals repo, and we want to find one. We only want one. So it takes an array, and we want the ISBN to match the given ISBN. Okay, so that looks good. Let's go and run that test. Brilliant. So we're now back to one failure, which is our end-to-end test, and the rest of the tests are all passing. So that's really good. So our repository at the moment, the functionality we need from it is all implemented, it all works. And we've done that with an integration test and actually talking to the database and making use of all of the Doctrine functionality we'd want to use to make our book repository work. So we haven't had to create any test doubles of Doctrine or any of its classes. We have just used it in our test as we will in production. So we know that at the moment the book repository implements all the functionality we want it to do, and it's going to work when we push it into production. So let's start using our book repository in our application. So if we close that test now and go back to our application. So we now need access to our book repository here inside our controller function. So we can do this. And we're going to use dependency injection at this point. So we need to set up dependency injection for our application. We need to create a dependency injection container. So let's do that. Container equals new container. There we go, di container. And our app factory needs to be given that container. So app factory set container $container. So now our application has a dependency injection container inside it that it passes into and allows access to things that we create inside the handlers. So let's create an instance of our book repository now. So container, and we want to set, and we need to give it a label to find by, so we'll call it book-repo, and the next argument is a function. So function. So okay. Now this function needs to return an instance of our book repository. So return new book repo. There we go. Import that. There we go. We know that our book repository needs an instance of the database connection, or the entity manager from Doctrine with the database connection inside it. We've got this database.php, which creates an instance here, which is used by the application and the Doctrine command line tool. So we can use this instance here. Now, what we should probably do is set up an instance of the Doctrine entity manager inside the container. But just to speed things up, we're just going to pass in that instance there by doing use entity manager, like so. And it's just going to bring in the one from the database here, so we can use it here. There we go. So that's our book repository all set up and available within our application to use. So let's carry on going. So now we need our book repository here. So to do that, we use $this get. We need to use that label again, which is book-repo, so book repo, book repo equals book repo. There we go. Our book equals this. So we're now well away. But now we've got a book which we want to turn into JSON. So how do we do this? Well, we could add a getter for each of the fields and create an array here and return that array, JSON encode that array and add that to our response. But let's see if we can do something tidier. Let's pretend, so we can do something like this: JSON equals JSON encode $book, like so. That would be better, wouldn't it? So we can JSON encode that book. It just makes it look a little bit neater. We can't do that just yet. We need to add some more functionality to our book class. So let's make a start on that. Now I need to add a unit test to our book class. Okay. So we've now got our book test. Okay, cool. This needs to extend test case. And we want to check, so new test, JSON serialize. This is where it becomes fun. So we do new book, book equals new book, another ISBN needed, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 1. Yeah, and we need to come up with another title, writing all the tests. Me again. Oh, let's go crazy. There we go. Many pages. We want to turn our book into JSON, and PHP offers us a interface at this point, which is the JSON serializable interface. And this interface offers one function called JSON serialize, for which you need to return representation of your object in a form that can be serialized. And in this case, we're going to just return an array as we would have created in our handler. So let's do that. So dollar expected JSON equals array again, take values, so again we expect ISBN, title, author, and number of pages, like so. Okay. And we can get our actual JSON to equal $book, and we're just going to call the function directly, so JSON serialize, and now we can make our assertion. So our expected JSON equals our actual JSON. Okay, so this is unit test, so we're just going to run this locally. And we know already that the JSON serialize function is not going to exist, so it's going to complain about that, but let's just run it to see. There we go, it doesn't exist. So let's open up our book class. Okay. And to add the function, let's do this. So we'll implement the JSON, there we go, serializable interface. And we'll ask our IDE to add the method. There we go. So now we can just do return an empty array, see it fail properly, rerun the test. So the arrays are not equal. And if we look at the difference, one's empty and one's got our values in it. Let's take this. And instead of hardcoding, we'll go straight to the answer. This ISBN. And the title. The author. And finally, the number of pages. Okay. And if we run that, that test all passes. So we can now go back again to our application. So if we go back down here and we look at JSON equals JSON encode to book, then we can do $response get body write the JSON. Okay. Now let's close everything up and run our tests and see where we're at. Okay. Our test has failed, but only very minorly through a simple typo of we were expecting number of pages, but our implementation said number of pages. So we can quickly fix that. So we're going to have to go and fix a few tests as well first. So this should be number of pages. So save that and run this unit test. That now fails. And we can go in and fix that one. Save. So if we run that now, that test goes to green. If we run all of our tests, and there we have it, a suite of green tests. So let's look over what we did. We first of all added an end-to-end test, which created an instance of a book in our database here, so a new book, pushed it into the database. We then made an API call to within our Docker container to our API the book by its ISBN on this URI. Once we got the response back, we checked we got 200, and then we got the book details that we'd saved into the database, and this test passed. We then moved into having to add a controller to handle the route that we wanted to create, and we created a book repository using integration testing rather than unit testing, so that we knew that the way we worked with Doctrine was correct rather than making assumptions in our test doubles. So we can now be really confident with the functionality we push into production, that we know that we use Doctrine how we should be using it rather than making assumptions on our test doubles. That's it for this video. In the next video, we will continue this and look at handling cases where we do not get back a book from the database. The 404 case for the book endpoint. Thank you for watching this episode of Testing All the Things. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please rate and review the video and subscribe to the channel. If you did not and you have any feedback, please leave a comment in the comment section of the video or contact me on Twitter @Bradle.